So tell us about hearing the news. Where were you about the announcement of the normalization?
I was having breakfast with Peter Kornblue in the Hotel Nacional, and we were told that Alan Gross had been. That's right, in Havana, and we learned through somebody came in with that had picked up a news release that Alan Gross was being released, and then we had early access to the fact sheet coming out of the White House on what actually was going to be done. And I want to compliment the Obama administration on going much larger and further than any of us expected it would go. There was a hope and an expectation that the Obama administration would do some things in the new year. But I must say, thanks to his national security team, they did go further, renewing diplomatic relations, a commitment to renew Cuba's inclusion on the terrorist list, which will conclude in 6 months. And I think it's pretty much understood that Cuba will be taken off. The thing that most interests me is the embargo, the commercial embargo on Cuba, and how far the administration will go. It's a little bit unclear. They talk about rulemakings at both the Commerce Department and Treasury Department, but you can see the broad outline of what they're doing. And it falls under the heading of adjusting the regulations to more effectively empower the Cuban people. So I think it's worth being clear what is contemplated and what is not right now. First, investment in Cuba is still prohibited. They talk about donative remittances to Cuba. So you can give money to the small Cuban private sector to establish businesses, things of that sort, but you can't really invest in Cuba. The U.S. commercial sector will be allowed to sell to Cuba, but in what appear to be quite limited ways right now. Agricultural equipment, goods to the small Cuban private sector. That doesn't seem to contemplate equipment or infrastructure development so much as perhaps items that could be sold by the emerging Cuban private sector. Building materials can be sold to Cubans for use in private construction. So a lot of this is going to depend on how the rules are written, but it's certainly encouraging what the president has done so far.
Can you respond to Michael Ratner? Michael, you said you feel that the embargo could be lifted not by an act of Congress, but by the president himself?
Well, I'm saying, and I'd be interested in hearing Peter's view, but yes, he can issue regulations, as Peter's talking about, licenses, et cetera, that would allow a lot more goods, et cetera, and services, investments in Cuba without actually getting Congress to move on the embargo. He's only gone a certain distance on that so far. He could go a lot farther in some examples I gave you. For example, he could open up travel completely. He could do a number of other things by regulation and licensing. And so Peter, who's an expert on this, would be interested in Bob. I'm sorry.
It's hard to...
Your response to that, Bob.
Well, Michael's correct that something missing is reciprocity in trade. Since 2000, the U.S.'s farmers have been able to sell agricultural commodities to Cuba. That's broadly defined. It includes everything from chewing gum to wine can be sold to Cuba. But Cuba can't sell anything to the United States yet. They have allowed U.S. travelers to Cuba to bring back $400 worth of Cuban goods as accompanied baggage. So they have to travel to Cuba and they bring it back with them. And they can bring up to $100 worth of tobacco and alcohol. Rum, of course, is what they'll be bringing. But I would like to see the administration move very quickly to some reciprocity in agricultural sales. Cuba produces sugar. It has a number of agricultural potential for exports to the U.S. I endorse completely what Michael said, that the president's ability to lift the embargo through licensing and rulemaking is essentially unfettered. The Helms-Burton Act, and it would require a longer discussion, comes into it at the very end. But the principal role of Congress is going to be to tidy up all the loose ends of permanent trade status for Cuba, investment protection agreements, and so on. Something I would like to alert your viewers to is there's going to be some pushback coming. We do have a Republican Congress now. I would expect to see a number of amendments inserted into appropriations bills that will try to limit presidential discretion in this area. And typically they'll attach it to must-pass legislation to put President Obama in a very difficult predicament. If he vetoes something he really wants, because it has some objectionable provision relating to Cuba, that's the dilemma they would like to put the president in. And I think it's going to require great vigilance to try to, from various sectors, including the U.S. business community, to try to prevent that happening. The pro-embargo elements in Congress has become much more bipartisan than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. Half the black congressional caucus, which is uniformly Democrat, now vote in favor of the embargo. That's been a product of very carefully targeted PAC contributions over time. So there's no, I say that we can expect this because the Congress is now Republican controlled. That doesn't mean a lot of Democrats don't support the embargo. It just means that senior Democrats like Pat Leahy, Dick Durbin, who traditionally took out these objectionable amendments in conference, legislative conference, won't be empowered to do that anymore. But it's a misapprehension to think that Democrats in Congress are uniformly in favor of lifting the embargo on Cuba.